Welcome to the second part of this video on how to process traumatic memories. If you haven't watched the first part yet, I suggest going and watching that one first. The next thing that you have to do is what I call shadow integration and fortitude towards ugliness. I kind of lump these two together. They're kind of different things, but they kind of go together. They kind of go hand in hand. And so what shadow integration is, so your shadow, this is a pretty well-established psychological concept, but your shadow is the part of you that you ignore, you deny exists, the part of you that makes you feel ashamed or guilty, the part of you that's kind of like gross, the part of you that's evil maybe, but not just evil, also cowardly, weak, spiteful, those kinds of things. But we all have a part of us, and as far as I've been able to tell, and as far as like the psychological concept goes, is basically we all have the same shadow. We're all equally bad. It's just some people end up in situations where their shadow is activated, or they're called forth, or they are in their shadow, however you want to think about it. And other people live their life where they never really are put in a situation where their shadow is expressed. So like in war, like your shadow comes to the forefront because you're killing people. And so your shadow wants to kill people. Your shadow likes killing people. Your shadow's like a psychopath, basically. Like your shadow's the devil, right? So you think of like the devil's like, mow him down, man, get him, yeah! And everyone has this, and all you have to do is just think about the game like Grand Theft Auto, right? Like, what does everyone do if you put someone down on Grand Theft Auto, right? And you let them just run around the map, just driving around, doing stuff. How long is it before they're running people over and buying a minigun so they can mow down as many cops as possible and just creating murder and mayhem, right? And that's your shadow, right? And it's not the thing necessarily where you can't get rid of it. Like, you can tame it, you can integrate it, and you can bring it under your control. But it's kind of like I talked with the Monuments of Misery. It's not something you can get rid of. So what do you do with it? It's like you integrate it and you make it part of yourself. And so it's like, because you have all these different like sub-personalities. So there's a bunch of different like parts of you that are you, and they all like think about things a different way. So like you might have a sub-personality that's like all the different sub-personalities that make up the sub-personality that is you as a father, or you as a mother, or you as a friend, or you as a soldier, or you as a policeman, or you as a lover, or you as a whatever, right? And there's also sub-personalities that come out when you're angry, that come out when you're really happy, that come out when you're really loving, right? So there's all these different parts of us, and they have different beliefs, and they have different desires, and they have different emotions, and they see the world differently, right? So they're like sub-personalities. And so one way of thinking about it is there's like a school bus, and there's all these different characters on the school bus, and all those characters are your sub-personality, right? And it's like, some of them are bad guys. Let's say that we condense all of them into one person, and it's like this psychopath, right? And I like to picture it like it's like a zombie apocalypse, and so it's a school bus of like random survivors, and like there's this one guy that's a total psycho, right? And maybe he was a serial killer before the apocalypse, and now he realizes he doesn't really want to murder people, but he just really loves killing, so zombies are good enough for him. And so he decides he needs these people in order for his own survival, so he decides, he's basically going to use all of his psychopathic, violent tendencies to protect them. Right? And that's basically what your shadow is. And so what do you do with that guy? Well, maybe you don't let him drive the bus, because who knows what he'd do if you put him behind the wheel, right? But you have him ride shotgun. And you say, listen, buddy, you're like a psychopath, so we're not going to let you make all the decisions. We're probably not really going to let you make any decisions. But if shit goes down, then you get to come out and play. But until then, just sit right here in the front seat and just kind of chill and just sit there. And if you don't know, the term shotgun, riding shotgun, comes from when there were like the stagecoaches, right? So like the Wells Fargo, stagecoaches would move money and stuff around, gold or whatever, here in the Wild West. And there'd be the driver, they'd be like doing the thing with the reins or whatever, however you drive a wagon. And then the guy sitting next to him would have a shotgun. And then that way, if like people, rode up and tried to rob him, the guy with the shotgun would blast him, right? So that's what it means to ride shotgun. You're sitting there with a shotgun, right? So that's the same idea. You have the devil ride shotgun. And that's what you do with your shadow. So you integrate it. And you think about like, well, why the hell do we have a shadow? Like, why do we have this part of ourselves that's like so inclined for death and destruction? Good question. I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Imagine a scenario where you're not traumatized at all. You're a really happy person. You've had a very happy life. You live like tens of thousands of years ago. And you're in some happy valley, right? Where there's a river and some lakes and like life, and there's berries, and like your tribe is there, right? And you've never known war, and you're just like happy, right? and you wake up in the middle of the night and you're being raided, and you like look over and like there's some awful shit happening to people you love. Well, if you had to sit there and think about what you should do and what's right or wrong and all that, like you're going to be overwhelmed and killed, right? Maybe everyone you care about is going to be overwhelmed and killed. So you see someone hurting the person you love, you get super fucking angry, you get really resentful towards the person and hateful towards the person that's doing it, and then you take all that rage and resentment, and what does that do? That calls up your shadow, and then you throw all that at them, and that's for survival, right? And so, and you think about like, here's a way you could get in touch with your shadow. Imagine someone that really hurt someone that you loved. And I'm not going to get too graphic with it, but imagine a scenario where it's like someone that like, you know, goes on like that movie Law Abiding Citizen, right? Like the killers or the people that kill his family are set free, and so he kidnaps them and tortures them or whatever. I don't know, I haven't seen the movie in a while, but you get the idea, right? So you just play a little game like, well, what would I do to someone that did that to someone I love? Oh, wow. How much would I enjoy doing that? Ooh, why would I enjoy it? Because I would feel so much anger and resentment. And so that's one of the reasons like anger and resentment are like good things to get rid of and not to live in those emotions, because they call up those worst aspects of ourselves, right? And so through this process of shadow integration, this is like ties back into the last one I talked about, which is the pattern recognition, right? And this is actually the other thing that Peterson talks about in that chapter in Beyond Order is basically recognizing that the world and people are not just good. They're good and bad, right? And that's kind of something that I'll talk about more with moral injury too, because with moral injury, you tend to think of people in the world as bad when some of them are bad, most of them are good, some of them are good, and the rest are somewhere in between, right? And so it's like the world is both good and bad. People are both good and bad. I actually came to the conclusion after looking at evil and really looking at people for a long time that with very few exceptions, most people try to do the right thing. Most people want to do the right thing. It's just oftentimes we find ourselves in situations where what we think is the right thing that might not necessarily be the right thing, right? And so it's like with looking at these patterns, which is the last one that I talked about, right? Looking at the patterns, it's part of that is shadow integration, because you're having to understand like why someone would do that. Why would someone do something that awful voluntarily and willingly, and how could they enjoy it? Right? That's like a really difficult question to answer. And it's like you have to understand that through your own shadow, because you're like that person. And that's really shitty thing to like work through and understand, right? And you don't want to let yourself think that you are that person or you're as bad as that person, because you wouldn't do those things, right? And that's the distinction. It's like, yes, you have a part of yourself that's capable of all these awful things, but you haven't done them. Right? And so it's about integrating that part of you, and like I said, putting the psycho to ride shotgun, right? No, buddy, you're not making the decisions here. But if shit goes down, then you can come out and play, right? And so, and that integration of the shadow actually makes you a stronger, more confident, more assertive person in the world. And that's something that Jordan Peterson talks about. I'll link a video about that in the description. And so I'd recommend reading the chapter in that book, because it really actually is it's a really good resource for understanding these two parts of processing traumatic memories, because he actually tells a story, because he was a clinical psychologist. So he worked with a lot of people that had trauma. And he actually talked about one of his clients that was basically, in order to resolve their issues, they were having, I forget exactly what it was, but it was something with, they were having like these weird fits or something. And in order to resolve that, they basically had to do shadow integration. And one of the things that he recommended was that they read a book called Ordinary Men. And the book follows a reserve police battalion, a Nazi reserve police battalion during World War II. And they go on to commit all these terrible atrocities, right? Murdering all these people and all these terrible things. And the reason the book is titled Ordinary Men is because this wasn't like some hardcore, like Hitler Youth thing that was brainwashed into wanting to kill people, right? These were like ordinary men that were family men that were middle-aged. And the reason that they went on to commit all these terrible acts was partly they felt obligated to do it, but partly it was their shadow. That part of themselves was basically just waiting for an opportunity to come out and play. And the justification they needed to do it out of patriotism, for their country, because they didn't want to let down their people, whatever story they told themselves, basically was just enough of a justification to allow that awful part of themselves to take over. And so And Peterson talks about in that chapter how by reading that book, they actually were able basically to overcome what happened to them. They had to, because I think if I remember right, he talks about how that person basically was raised in a home where they were taught that people were only good and people were angels. And so when this person had a traumatic event where they were confronted with like the shadow of someone, right? Someone doing something bad to them, it like broke their conceptualization of the world, and in order to repair it, they had to do shadow integration. Now, the second part of this I call fortitude towards ugliness, and I've never really seen this talked about anywhere. And it's another term that I made up. I like to do that because when I identify something, like I want words that I can just point right to that idea, and so I make up terms for things where they don't exist. And what I call fortitude towards ugliness is basically it's just that. It's like your ability to withstand seeing or being aware of these awful things. And I'll give you an example of why I think this is such a fundamental aspect of processing traumatic memories. Fairly late in my journey, I had repressed memories. And the way it basically worked was, it's like the stuff that I could remember was like, say like 3 out of 10 bad, 4 out of 10 bad, 5 out of 10 bad, right? But then the stuff that I couldn't remember was like 6 out of 10 bad, 8 out of 10 bad, 9 out of 10 bad, right? And then as I worked through these lower monuments of misery, I started to uncover and remember these other ones. And so it's like I had to like level myself up in order to be able to psychologically and emotionally deal with these other more traumatic memories. And kind of late in my journey, I was dealing with one of the ones that were like one of the more bad ones, however you phrase that, it's a weird one. But like basically I had remembered this thing and I had accepted that this thing really did happen to me. But I remember just like sitting on my couch, kind of like I was actually like half laying, half sitting, and I was just like looking out the window at these trees I had outside my apartment, and I was like looking at them, and I was like meditating in a way. I wasn't thinking thoughts, but I was just keeping my attention on the fact that this thing had really happened to me. And I didn't want to accept it because it was so ugly and so awful and so gross. And I was like, I don't want that to be real. I don't want that to really be part of my story. Like, I don't want to live in a world where that thing actually happens. Like, this is disgusting. Like, why is this No, like I didn't want to accept that it really had happened to me because it was just so gross and so ugly. But what I made myself do was I just sat there and just kept my attention on that thing. Because it's like this whole day was basically like I had the memory come up in the morning, and I was basically spent the day like processing, working through it, like accepting it. Like there was, so I'd like cry for an hour straight, be super emotional, and then be like just basically depressed for an hour, like pacing around the house, and then I'd decide to go for a run or whatever, and then I'd come back from that and take a shower, and then I'd be super emotional for another hour or whatever, it's like I said, it's a process, and I was kind of bouncing around doing these different things that I'm talking about in this video. But with this fortitude towards ugliness, what I was doing for certain periods of it was I was just sitting there and I wasn't thinking really any thoughts, but I was keeping my focus and my attention on this thing that had happened to me. And what I was doing was I was allowing myself, whatever parts of me this was, I was allowing them to rearrange and grow and transform, because I had to develop into the kind of person that could withstand being in a world where such things happened, being strong enough to move past something like that happening to me, being strong enough to accept how disgusting that is. And it's kind of weird because I had a similar experience happen with integrating my sexuality. And this is something I think everyone has to go through at some point in their life. But there are like layers and levels to integrating your sexuality, right? And one of them is can be accepting how sexual the opposite sex actually is, especially if for whatever reason you've conceptualized the opposite sex as something that's pure and good, and sex is the opposite of pure and good, and then now you have to change you have to reconceptualize how sex fits into life, Because like if you were sexually abused as a child, like sex is this really awful, disgusting thing to you. And you might be a hypersexual person. And so then you end up conflicted all the time because you're very hypersexual, because you were sexualized at a young age, but you think of sex as this nasty, disgusting thing. And so then now you have to like work through that, right? And so looking at it and kind of just accepting that like, yeah, I guess it's kind of gross, but it's also kind of just part of life. And just letting yourself like mature and grow and accept that that is the world and that is the way people are and that is life. You know, and some things, and I'm not saying that sex is not necessarily ugly, although I guess some parts of it are a little gross, you know, I don't know, like, you know, but overall, like it's a beautiful thing, it's a wonderful thing, it's a nice thing, it's one of the best aspects of being human, right? But it's kind of similar to this where like looking at it kind of gives you this like feeling of disgust, especially if your disgust sensitivity is high, which is an aspect of personality, it's a personality trait. And so it's kind of like looking at it and kind of letting yourself get, I hate to say it, but comfortable with it, you know? I wanted to add that aggression and sexuality are two of the big parts of your shadow. So it's not that your shadow is all bad and all evil. It's just, it's the parts of you that make you uncomfortable, that make you ashamed, that maybe make you feel disgusted or guilty. And so it would make sense that integrating your sexuality would feel similar to integrating other elements of your shadow that maybe we could describe as malevolent or evil. And this aspect of shadow integration, this kind of hardening or toughening up towards reality as it is something that's talked about in relation to shadow integration. I've just never seen it specifically called out. And I think that it's important enough that it warrants kind of its own term and to be talked about specifically. And in that chapter of Beyond Order, Peterson actually talks about how when he works with clients on shadow integration, he can actually see a change in their faces, that their faces actually, the way that they look, actually changes. And so really that one is just about letting yourself, like fortitude towards ugliness is about letting yourself grow to be strong enough to withstand the ugliness of whatever the thing is, right? And I think that is a crucial part of being able to fully move past something, right? Because that's really when you're becoming bigger than the thing that happened to you, right? That's one of the main aspects of doing that, right? And you have to be bigger than the things that happen to you if you want to move past them. And so then we move on to the fourth way to process traumatic memories. And all four of these are going to kind of happen like over and over again as you process them. So it's not like you're going to do all the emotional purging and then you're going to do all the pattern recognition and then you're going to do all the shadow integration and then you're going to do this fourth thing. But it's like you're going to do some of this and then some of this, and you go back and do some emotional purging while you're doing some of the shadow integration, and then you're going to do some of the pattern recognition, and then you're going to do more emotional purging and then more shadow integration, right? So you're going to bounce between these. But this fourth one is the one that's going to you're going to start to do later on in the processing process. But you also might do some of it early on, and it's probably a good idea to do some of this early on. So what I call this one is time and narrative. And it's time and narrative because time is recognizing that this thing happened back whenever it happened. Because there are parts of your brain that don't really perceive time. And so you're reacting emotionally as if it was happening to you now, when in fact it happened maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or maybe it happened when you were a child. And so it's like, that thing happened to me when I was a child. I'm not a child anymore. Now I'm an adult and I exist in a different world. And because I exist in a different world, I don't need to feel like I did back then. Because the way that I felt was as a child that was in a dangerous world. Maybe I was alone. Maybe the people that were supposed to be protecting me were the ones that were hurting me. So I'm not defenseless. I'm not helpless. I'm an adult now. I'm capable, right? And so it's this recognizing the time, but also the narrative of it, right? That narrative of this is something that was in my past. I've worked through it. I've moved past it. I'm not going to let it impact me anymore. I'm not going to let it hold me back. I'm going to use it as a catalyst for living my best life. Yes, I said that. There's a saying that I really, really like this saying. And it's kind of like goes back, it's like kind of rooted in like Zen in a way. So the saying is, the present defines the past and we can imagine our future. And what that means is that we tend to think of things based on where we are now. So it's like if you lose your job, right, you get fired, you're like, oh my God, this is the worst thing that ever happened to me. But then if you, a month later, get a better job that pays way more money, that has better hours, and you like the people you're working with, well then losing your job is a good thing, right? And there's this Zen story, you've probably heard it, I'll kind of tell like a somewhat condensed version. So there's a Zen farmer, and his horse runs away. He has this beautiful prize horse, and it runs away. And his neighbor shows up and finds out and says, oh man, what bad luck. And the Zen farmer says, we'll see. And then a week later, the horse brings back a dozen wild horses, beautiful horses, right? And then the neighbor comes over and sees it and remarks to the Zen farmer, wow, you're so lucky. And the Zen farmer says, we'll see. A week after that, the farmer's son gets thrown off one of the wild horses while he's trying to train it and breaks his leg. And the neighbor finds out and says, oh, what bad luck. The Zen farmer says, we'll see. A week later, the army shows up to conscript all the men of fighting age to go fight in the war. The farmer's son, his leg is broken, so he can't go, so he's spared. And the neighbor remarks, well, good luck. And the farmer says, we'll see. And the point of that story is that things that look like they're a good thing might lead to something bad, and things that are a bad thing might lead to something good. And so that's kind of where that idea of the present defines the past comes from, right? We tend to look at our past based on where it's led us. And so if you have all these horrible things happen to you, but then because of those horrible things, you go through this whole process of psychological growth and transformation, and you do all this shadow integration, you do all this ego development, and you develop your authenticity, and you develop your consciousness, and you become this completely different person that you never would have become that person if that thing hadn't happened to you. And if you hadn't had to go through that process, you never would have become that person. Well, now you're somewhere you wouldn't be except for that awful thing that happened to you. And that is a hard thing to be grateful for your trauma. But I would say that's one of the later stages of healing. Like if you can actually feel gratitude, like, thank you, universe, for giving me that experience. Thank you. And mean it. Like, yeah, you know. And then where are you, right? And so, and you can imagine your future. The second part of it has to do with, well, what are you going to do now, right? Like, yeah, that thing happened to you, and yeah, you're suffering, and you're all kinds of broken and messed up, like I was. Are you going to stay that way? Or are you going to use this as an opportunity to heal, as an opportunity to understand yourself, as an opportunity to develop yourself, as an opportunity to learn more about life and the human experience, and as a reason to double down and to go all in on living your best life, like to really live your best life? Because a lot of the most extraordinary people in the world had trauma in their lives, and then they overcame it and they went on to do good things. And so that's that narrative aspect of it, you know, where you're fitting that thing that happened to you into your story. And especially if you had repressed memories, one of the ways I think, and I need to think about this more and maybe do some reading, I'm going to eventually make a video on repressed memories. They're really tricky because it's like I had a lot of repressed memories, and like I still question, like, did some of those things really happen? Because they just seem so far out there, you know. But memory's a weird thing. And it's like as I integrated these memories, as I made them part of my story, all of a sudden my past started to make more sense. It's like, oh, that's why I was like that when I was 11. That's why I felt like that when I was 13. That's why I you know, whatever, you know, your life starts to make more sense. And so even as you integrate a trauma that you're aware of, it might be the case that aspects, oh, that's why I ended up in an abusive relationship. Oh, that's why I didn't take care of myself. Oh, that's why I ended up addicted to whatever, right? And so things start to make more sense as you understand how this thing affected you and as you fit it into your story. And I think all four of these are necessary aspects of processing a traumatic memory and sorting through it and putting it away and putting it in your past where it belongs so that you can move on into your future. And so I don't know, like, depending on your situation and your monument of misery or monuments of misery, because you probably have more than one, because trauma is cumulative. And so the people that have really severe PTSD, it's most likely that you had a bunch of different things happen to you. That's like most of my friends that are like have a lot of PTSD, like it wasn't just one thing, it was a bunch of different things, right? So you have to work through all these different things. And it might not be the case that you completely resolve one and then completely resolve the next one and then completely resolve this one and then completely resolve. It might be the case you work on this one a little bit and get rid of some of the emotional charge and make sense of this one. And then because you learned this and because you developed your fortitude towards ugliness. You can work on this one a little bit, and you start to do more shadow integration here and emotionally purge, and then you start to work on this one over here, and then you do some work on this one over here, and and so, or it might be more sequential, where you do 80% of the work on this one, and then you start working on this one, and you do 5%, you start working on this one, you do another 5%, you start working on this one, and this one, and this one, and you get all of them mostly done, and then you do the last 5%. So it's gonna look different for different people, right? And then the other thing to talk about, I guess, is like, well, what does this actually look like? Like, what does it actually look like when you're doing these things? And it's like, well, honestly, a lot of it is just spending time with yourself, spending time with your own thoughts, which is going to be hard for people, especially extroverts, because extroverts get their energy from being around people. And so to be alone is difficult for them. And a lot of people have a hard time being alone with their own thoughts. I think, who was it that said, well, here's the quote. And it's true. Like, people have a hard time being alone with their thoughts. And so do it in a way that's somewhat enjoyable. You have to make this process, I don't want to say make it enjoyable, because you can't. But you can make it more as enjoyable as you can. And so I'm going to make another video. I'm going to talk about how important I think traveling is for the healing process. Because one of the things that you can do is like I'm up here camping by myself. I've learned to really enjoy traveling alone. And one of the first things you can do with that is take yourself out to lunch. Go to lunch by yourself. And you probably don't want to be emotionally purging in the restaurant, right? But just this act of like learning to do stuff with yourself, get comfortable being alone, get comfortable with your own mind, with your own thoughts, and then learn to enjoy traveling alone. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's like, look, it's like if you're going to drive 4 hours somewhere, right? Well, while you're driving, that's a good time to emotionally purge, as long as you're not like so emotional that you're like a danger on the road, right? I mean, maybe you need to pull over, maybe you need to emotionally purge when it's, more opportune. But it's also, driving alone is a good time to process things, to think about things, like, all this. And it doesn't have to be the case where the entire trip is just negative processing and all this, right? Like, it also should be fun, because part of healing moral injury is developing a fun and playful and positive relationship with reality and with people. And so traveling is a good way to do that, because it gets you out of your habits, right? It gets you out of your daily routine, shifts you into a new environment where you don't have all the same patterns. And habits. Habits exist not just in behavioral patterns, action, but also in terms of how you think about things, in terms of how you feel about things, the story we tell ourselves. And so traveling is a good way to do that, right? But just learning to spend time alone. And so maybe it's a Saturday morning where, you wake up and you have a cup of coffee and you sit on the couch and, you're sitting there and you're thinking and you start feeling emotional, and you let yourself feel emotional. Maybe you go back to the bedroom and you scream and cry into a pillow. It's okay to do that. I've done that for hundreds of hours, and I don't feel ashamed to admit that, because I had to, because the things that happened to me were that fucking awful. And being able to admit that was part of the healing process, right? And so feel it, man. Let yourself feel it. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong. So hopefully you're finding these videos useful and interesting. Thanks for watching.